Victoria Hale believed in control, control over markets, control over growth, control over loss. That belief built her empire. It also built her walls. Then one rainy night, she broke her own rule and brought two homeless boys into her life. She thought she was changing their future. She didn't realize she was raising the one person who would one day challenge her power, question her success, and force her to confront a truth she had avoided for decades. She gave them security. They gave her accountability. And when the truth came out, it didn't just threaten her company. It threatened who she believed she was. Victoria Hale built her life on precision. At 49, she stood at the helm of one of the most influential urban infrastructure analytics corporations in the United States, headquartered in downtown Chicago. Her company specialized in predictive redevelopment modeling, advising cities on transit optimization, housing expansion, and commercial growth corridors. Investors described her as visionary. Policy leaders called her indispensable. Business magazines often framed her as the architect of modern urban efficiency. She accepted those labels without emotion, as if they were titles engraved on glass rather than reflections of a life lived. Her rise had not been accidental. Raised in a modest Midwestern household, Victoria learned early that discipline created opportunity. Scholarships carried her through college. Relentless work ethic carried her through the early years of her startup. She outmaneuvered competitors by anticipating shifts in data before others recognized patterns. Control became her advantage. Markets fluctuated, but she remained steady. Publicly, she appeared composed and philanthropic. Her foundation funded public libraries, STEM scholarships, and community development grants. Photographs captured her at ribbon cuttings and policy forums, poised and articulate. Yet those images revealed little about the private quiet that followed her home. Her penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan, a sweep of glass and steel suspended high above the city's constant motion. The interior reflected minimalism, neutral palettes, clean lines, curated art chosen more for balance than sentiment. No framed family photos lined the walls. No clutter disrupted the symmetry. The space felt controlled, curated, insulated. Control had not always been ambition. It had once been survival. When Victoria was 17, her younger sister Abigail drowned during a summer afternoon at a family lake house. The accident unfolded in seconds, but its weight stretched across decades. Victoria had been responsible for watching her. A moment of distraction, a decision to step away. The memory replayed without mercy. Though authorities ruled it accidental, Victoria internalized a harsher verdict. If she had been more attentive, more vigilant, more controlled, Abigail would have lived. From that day forward, chaos became the enemy. She constructed a belief that governed her adult life: control prevents loss. Attachment introduces risk. Distance protects stability. Sleep rarely arrived easily. On nights when rain streaked against the penthouse windows, she stood barefoot before the glass, watching droplets distort the skyline lights. Insomnia did not trouble her schedule. She functioned on discipline, but it unsettled her silence. The city pulsed below, unaware of the grief she carried behind polished composure. Holidays passed with strategic travel. Invitations were declined with polite efficiency. Romantic relationships never survived her emotional perimeter. She convinced herself that focus required sacrifice. Expansion required detachment. Her corporation grew across major American cities, advising redevelopment projects that reshaped neighborhoods with algorithmic confidence. Growth charts satisfied investors. Efficiency satisfied municipalities. Results satisfied her, yet grief remained unsolved. After a late executive dinner celebrating a new municipal contract, Victoria exited the restaurant into a steady Chicago rain. The city shimmered beneath streetlights. Her driver opened the car door, shielding her from the downpour. She paused briefly, eyes scanning the dim space beneath a nearby overpass. There, partially hidden from the rain, two boys sat close together, thin jackets pulled tight, their posture defensive but quiet. They were not asking for help. They were simply enduring. Victoria felt the old instinct to proceed forward, to remain uninvolved, to preserve order. Instead, she stopped. Rain collected in shallow rivers beneath the downtown overpass as traffic hummed overhead, indifferent to the small figures huddled beneath it. Victoria Hale remained seated in the back of her car longer than usual, watching through tinted glass. The city's glow reflected faintly across the windshield, illuminating two boys pressed close together for warmth, but careful not to appear desperate. They were not begging. They were enduring. Ethan Cole stood slightly in front of his younger brother, tall for 15 but visibly underweight, shoulders tense with a vigilance that did not belong to childhood. His eyes scanned every approaching vehicle, calculating risk before hope. Survival had sharpened him. Since their mother's fatal overdose 18 months earlier, the foster system had moved them through temporary homes with bureaucratic efficiency. Each relocation carried the same threat separation. Ethan learned quickly that compliance did not guarantee protection, so he chose defiance. When authorities attempted to place Caleb in a different home due to medical needs, Ethan ran. He ran not out of rebellion but out of loyalty. Caleb Cole, 10 years old, leaned against his brother's side, smaller, quieter, with an inward gentleness that contrasted Ethan's guarded stance. His breathing carried a faint wheeze beneath the sound of rainfall, a chronic respiratory weakness aggravated by cold air and stress. He held a small sketch pad inside his jacket, edges curled from moisture. Even in instability, he carried paper and pencil. It was his way of holding on to something that felt controlled. Victoria told herself to instruct the driver to proceed. Chicago's streets were filled with need. She could not intervene in every circumstance. Her foundation funded shelters and youth programs precisely for situations like this. Systems existed. Processes were in place. Personal involvement complicated clarity. Yet something about their posture unsettled her certainty. The older boy's protective stance felt achingly familiar, as if echoing a version of herself she had tried to discipline into silence. Minutes passed. The rain did not soften. Caleb coughed, and Ethan instinctively shifted closer. Victoria opened the car door. The decision was not dramatic. It was deliberate. She approached with measured calm, offering temporary shelter, food, and medical assessment. Ethan's expression remained cautious, distrust ingrained by broken promises. Caleb looked up with wary curiosity. Victoria did not offer assurances beyond what she could control. She offered structure. Within hours, her team arranged discreet hotel accommodations and scheduled a physician to evaluate Caleb's breathing. Legal counsel outlined the complexity of emergency guardianship, warning of regulatory oversight and public scrutiny. Victoria insisted the arrangement would be short-term assistance until formal placement stabilized. She repeated the phrase more to herself than to anyone else. Temporary support extended into structured oversight. Check-ins became visits. Medical evaluations revealed Caleb's condition required consistent monitoring. Caseworkers acknowledged the brothers' attachment but explained that placing them separately would streamline long-term solutions. The word streamline lingered coldly in the air. Victoria listened without visible reaction. Separation would simplify paperwork. It would not simplify consequence. A woman who never interfered had already interfered once. When official documents were placed before her, outlining full guardianship authority, she did not hesitate. She signed. Victoria Hale's Lake Forest estate stood behind iron gates and manicured hedges, its stone facade reflecting quiet authority rather than warmth. When Ethan and Caleb first stepped inside, the ceilings felt too high and the floors too polished, as though the house had been designed for presentation rather than living. The air carried the faint scent of polished wood and filtered air, a sharp contrast to the crowded apartments and temporary shelters they had known. Stability surrounded them, yet neither boy relaxed. Ethan's adjustment was strategic rather than emotional. He moved through the estate memorizing details, camera placements along hallways, blind spots near stairwells, staff routines, entry codes on side doors. Years of instability had trained him to anticipate disruption. Gratitude existed somewhere beneath the surface, but it did not replace caution. He answered questions respectfully but briefly, careful not to reveal dependence. His posture remained guarded, shoulders slightly squared as if expecting the ground to shift again. Caleb reacted differently. He wandered into the expansive library, running his fingers along shelves lined with leather-bound volumes. In a converted sunroom overlooking the lake, he discovered an unused art studio once intended for architectural planning sessions. Natural light spilled across blank canvases. For the first time since their mother's death, he lingered somewhere without fear of being told to pack. Victoria observed these adjustments with a measured distance that unsettled her more than she admitted. She knew how to scale companies and restructure departments. She did not know how to nurture children. She responded the only way she understood, by constructing systems. Private tutors were hired to close educational gaps. A child psychologist began weekly sessions. Additional security protocols were added discreetly. She convinced herself that structure equaled safety. Media outlets eventually caught wind of the guardianship arrangement. Headlines speculated about public image strategy and calculated philanthropy. Board members privately questioned potential reputational risks, suggesting that emotional decisions could distract from executive focus. Victoria dismissed those concerns publicly, but she felt their weight privately. She had built a life immune to unpredictability. Now unpredictability lived under her roof. One winter night, Caleb experienced a severe breathing episode triggered by seasonal cold. Medical staff responded quickly, assuring her the condition was manageable with consistent treatment. Yet after the house quieted, Victoria remained seated beside his bed long after midnight. She monitored the subtle rhythm of his breathing, adjusting blankets and listening carefully for irregularity. The city skyline was distant here, replaced by the steady darkness of the lake. For the first time in years, she did not reach for her phone. She had offered stability, but she began learning vulnerability. Small shifts followed. She attended school events quietly, choosing seats in the back row rather than reserved sections. International business trips were shortened or rescheduled entirely. Control no longer meant distance, it meant presence. At the suggestion of a public relations advisor, a formal family portrait was commissioned. The image captured Victoria standing composed between Ethan and Caleb in the grand hallway, the symmetry almost theatrical. The framed photograph hung prominently near the staircase, a symbol of order restored. Years passed with gradual adaptation. Ethan grew taller, sharper, more analytical. Caleb's artwork filled once empty walls. The estate carried new sounds, footsteps, muted laughter, late-night study sessions. At Ethan's high school graduation, as applause echoed across the auditorium, Victoria watched him step forward to receive his diploma. Pride rose instinctively. Then she noticed something in his gaze as he scanned the crowd. It was not gratitude. It was scrutiny. 7 years reshaped the visible outline of their lives, though the emotional architecture beneath remained complex. Ethan Cole arrived at Georgetown University with the quiet intensity of someone who understood that opportunity carried responsibility. He chose to study public policy and urban economics, drawn not by abstract theory but by lived memory. Lecture halls overlooking Washington's historic streets became spaces where data intersected with moral consequence. Professors noted his precision. His research papers reflected lived experience layered beneath disciplined analysis. Caleb, now older and steadier in health, attended an elite art academy in Chicago. His work evolved into large-scale urban landscapes fractured by subtle distortions, buildings leaning slightly, sidewalks dissolving into blurred edges. Critics described his style as emotionally restrained but deeply reflective. While Ethan examined systems through numbers, Caleb translated memory into color and texture. Meanwhile, the public narrative surrounding Victoria Hale remained polished. Articles celebrated her long-term guardianship of 2 boys who had once lived under an overpass. Her foundation's philanthropic reports highlighted scholarship expansions and youth housing grants. Corporate expansion continued across major American cities, advising redevelopment initiatives with algorithmic efficiency. To observers, it was a complete circle of redemption. For Ethan, the circle felt incomplete. During a graduate seminar analyzing redevelopment incentives, he encountered case studies detailing urban displacement patterns following predictive infrastructure modeling. Certain neighborhoods experienced accelerated rent increases after transit optimization and zoning recalibration. The language was neutral, statistical, yet the implications unsettled him. He began cross-referencing project timelines with publicly available filings from Victoria's corporation. Patterns emerged slowly. Expansion years aligned with redevelopment zones that had displaced low-income tenants. Though her firm had not directly forced evictions, its predictive modeling had increased property values in vulnerable communities. Efficiency had accelerated transition. Growth had restructured neighborhoods. The realization formed gradually but firmly the system that saved him may have harmed families like his own. Ethan did not approach Victoria immediately. He revisited reports, combed through municipal contracts, and studied internal strategy summaries available through regulatory disclosures. His analysis remained careful, factual, devoid of accusation. Yet privately, moral conflict deepened. Gratitude toward Victoria coexisted with discomfort about the broader implications of her company's work. Caleb sensed the shift long before it surfaced publicly. During family dinners at the Lake Forest estate, Ethan's focus lingered on economic policy discussions rather than personal updates. His posture tightened when corporate headlines appeared on television. Caleb understood both sides. Victoria's intention to build efficiency and Ethan's instinct to question consequence. He feared that confronting the truth might fracture the fragile stability they had built. Ethan chose distance rather than confrontation. Under a pseudonym, he began publishing investigative research examining the unintended social costs of predictive redevelopment analytics. His work avoided personal references and centered on systemic accountability. Academic journals expressed interest. Policy blogs amplified his findings. He convinced himself that anonymity preserved family while protecting principle. Then one autumn morning, an email appeared in his university inbox from a national investigative journalist who had traced the methodology behind the pseudonym. The message was concise but unmistakable. The reporter requested confirmation of authorship and access to supporting data. Ethan understood immediately that what had begun as academic inquiry was about to become public reckoning. The exposé was published at precisely 6:30 on a Monday morning, time to intercept financial markets before the opening bell. By mid-morning, major national outlets had amplified the investigation, citing data that linked Victoria Hales Corporation to predictive redevelopment strategies that accelerated housing displacement in several low-income neighborhoods across Chicago, Baltimore, and St. Louis. The report did not accuse her company of breaking the law. Instead, it illuminated a pattern data-driven efficiency that increased property values faster than communities could adapt. Within minutes of market opening, the company's stock price declined sharply. Analysts speculated about regulatory scrutiny. Investors demanded immediate clarification. Television panels debated ethical accountability versus economic progress. Victoria sat at the head of her downtown boardroom table, reviewing the report in silence as financial projections shifted on surrounding screens. The language in the article was methodical, built on years of municipal contracts and redevelopment timelines. Embedded within the evidence were excerpts from research papers that had first appeared under a pseudonym in academic circles. The journalist's tone remained factual, yet the narrative was unmistakable. The same corporation celebrated for philanthropy had contributed, indirectly, to displacement cycles affecting vulnerable families. Board members expressed controlled urgency. Legal advisors recommended a strategic response emphasizing compliance and positive impact metrics. Public relations teams drafted statements highlighting charitable initiatives. Victoria listened, composed but unsettled. As archived internal memos were retrieved for review, she encountered documents she had once approved without extended scrutiny. Footnotes referenced accelerated turnover rates and transitional demographic optimization. The terminology had felt neutral at the time. Now it felt incomplete. Then came the revelation that reframed everything. Her legal counsel discreetly confirmed the identity behind the pseudonymous research cited in the exposé. The investigative journalist had corroborated authorship through university records. The source was not a competitor, activist, or disgruntled executive. It was Ethan Cole, the boy she had taken in from the rain. The young man she had financed through education and opportunity. The one who had studied systems with the discipline she admired. The public backlash intensified as commentators juxtaposed two narratives: a powerful CEO who rescued two boys from poverty, and a corporation whose models had facilitated displacement in neighborhoods like the one those boys once inhabited. Social media framed it as hypocrisy. Editorial columns questioned whether philanthropy could compensate for structural harm. Inside the Lake Forest estate, emotional distance replaced routine calm. Ethan remained measured, neither defensive nor triumphant. Caleb moved quietly between rooms, sensing the widening gap between principle and protection. Victoria experienced a fracture not of reputation alone, but of certainty. The boy she sheltered had become the architect of her fall. Yet beneath the sting of exposure lay a sharper question. Was this betrayal or accountability? Had she raised a son who defied her, or a young man who understood responsibility differently? By evening, the board convened an emergency session. The agenda was direct. A vote would determine whether Victoria Hale would remain CEO of the company she built or become the first casualty of its reckoning. The vote concluded without spectacle. The board framed the decision as a temporary leadership adjustment intended to stabilize market confidence, but its impact was unmistakable. Victoria Hale was removed as acting CEO pending further review. Press releases described it as procedural. Financial analysts described it as necessary. For Victoria, it felt like the quiet dismantling of an identity she had spent decades constructing. Media coverage intensified throughout the week. News anchors debated ethical corporate governance. Investor panels speculated about long-term valuation shifts. Protest groups revisited redevelopment case studies cited in the exposé. The corporation's stock fluctuated unpredictably, and shareholders demanded visible accountability. Victoria declined televised interviews. She released only a brief written statement acknowledging concern and promising cooperation. Back at the Lake Forest estate, silence returned in a way that felt familiar and unwelcome. The house had once carried cautious laughter and academic ambition. Now it echoed with restrained tension. Staff moved discreetly, avoiding eye contact during televised updates. The formal family portrait near the staircase seemed less symbolic of unity and more like a relic of simpler narratives. Ethan returned home 2 days after the vote, prepared for rejection. He expected confrontation or distance. Instead, he encountered something more unsettling, a composure. Victoria did not accuse him publicly or privately. She requested space to review internal documents alone, retreating into her study for long hours each evening. Stacks of archived impact assessments accumulated across her desk. Reports she had once skimmed now demanded full attention. She revisited redevelopment analytics that prioritized efficiency benchmarks over long-term community stability. The language of optimization read differently under scrutiny. She recognized the pattern clearly. She had prioritized profit over pause, growth over reflection, legality over consequence. The realization did not manifest as collapse. It settled gradually, heavy and undeniable. Meanwhile, Caleb's health faltered under the strain of public controversy. A stress-related respiratory relapse required medical monitoring. Doctors assured the condition was manageable, but the recurrence unsettled the fragile calm that had defined recent years. The hospital visits were not dramatic, yet they served as a reminder that stability remained conditional. Victoria's legal advisors proposed aggressive responses to protect her position, challenging the expose's framing, pursuing reputational repair campaigns, leveraging regulatory compliance defenses. She listened carefully before declining. Retaliation would restore optics but not integrity. For the first time, she chose restraint over control. Losing power revealed responsibility. In the quiet of her study, Victoria began drafting a comprehensive restitution and restructuring plan. It included voluntary audits of redevelopment contracts, independent oversight committees, and a housing stabilization fund directed toward affected neighborhoods. The proposal would reduce short-term profitability but address structural oversight gaps. The board acknowledged the plan but emphasized that public accountability required more than internal reform. Federal legislators announced a congressional-style hearing to evaluate the broader implications of predictive redevelopment analytics across major U.S. cities. Victoria was formally requested to testify. The date was scheduled. National attention intensified. For the first time in her career, Victoria Hale would not stand before investors or executives. She would stand before the country. The hearing chamber in Washington carried a different weight than any corporate boardroom Victoria Hale had ever entered. Bright overhead lights erased shadows, and cameras lined the perimeter with patient precision. Lawmakers, policy advisors, journalists, and advocacy groups filled the seats behind her. The atmosphere was not hostile, but it was expectant. National attention had condensed into this moment, and for the first time in her career, Victoria understood that influence could not substitute for accountability. When she was called to speak, she did not begin with defense. She began with acknowledgement. She explained how predictive redevelopment analytics had been designed to optimize efficiency and attract investment, but she conceded that optimization without adequate community safeguards accelerated displacement in vulnerable neighborhoods. She did not deny legality, yet she refused to hide behind it. She admitted that expansion targets had sometimes overshadowed caution. The room grew still, not because her words were dramatic, but because they were unguarded. Redemption through accountability rarely arrives loudly. It arrives through clarity. Victoria announced the immediate launch of a national housing stabilization fund financed through her personal holdings. The fund would support rental protection programs, relocation assistance, and independent impact audits for redevelopment projects. More strikingly, she declared her decision to transfer a majority of her shares into an independent community trust governed by housing policy experts and civic leaders. Control, once the foundation of her identity, would no longer rest solely in her hands. Media coverage shifted tone within hours. Analysts described the move as unprecedented. Investors expressed shock at the voluntary surrender of majority ownership. Critics questioned whether it was strategic or sincere. Yet the symbolic weight was undeniable. Victoria was relinquishing dominance to protect long-term integrity. Ethan addressed the committee after her testimony. His voice remained composed, his analysis grounded in data rather than accusation. He clarified that his research had not been motivated by revenge or resentment. It had been motivated by responsibility. Gratitude and accountability, he explained, were not opposites. A system could offer opportunity and still require reform. His presence reframed the narrative from family conflict to generational evolution. Back in Chicago weeks later, Caleb unveiled a new art exhibit titled Moving Foundations. The gallery walls displayed large canvases portraying cityscapes layered over faint outlines of families in motion. Buildings appeared solid at first glance, yet subtle distortions suggested fragility beneath permanence. Critics described the exhibit as contemplative rather than confrontational. Viewers lingered quietly before each piece, recognizing the emotional tension without being told how to interpret it. At home, the estate no longer felt divided by silence. Conversations carried a cautious honesty. Victoria accepted an advisory role within her corporation rather than reclaiming executive control. She chose legacy over dominance, impact over authority. Stability returned gradually, imperfect but genuine. Then, months later, as winter settled across Lake Forest, Victoria's phone rang late one evening with a hospital number she recognized instantly. The fragile peace they had rebuilt trembled once again. The hospital corridor was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as though even sound understood the need for restraint. Caleb's condition, though serious, was treatable. The stress of public scrutiny and emotional upheaval had intensified his respiratory complications, but doctors remained cautiously optimistic. Stability would require consistency, careful monitoring, and time. Time, Victoria realized, was something she had once measured in quarterly reports. Now she measured it in steady breaths and incremental improvements. She remained at Caleb's bedside each day, not out of obligation but choice. Meetings were rescheduled or delegated entirely. Her presence no longer felt like an interruption to ambition. It felt like alignment with something deeper. The city skyline beyond the hospital window continued its restless movement, yet Victoria's focus narrowed to the subtle rise and fall of her son's chest. She read medical notes carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and listened without impatience. Control, she began to understand, did not always mean command. Sometimes it meant commitment. Ethan postponed his graduate school admission without announcement. Officially, it was described as a deferred enrollment. Privately, it was a decision rooted in loyalty. He coordinated treatment schedules, reviewed insurance logistics, and ensured household routines continued without disruption. The Lake Forest estate gradually shifted from corporate symbol to lived-in home. Staff presence diminished. Shared meals replaced formal dining. Quiet evenings replaced televised market commentary. Domestic calm replaced corporate dominance. In that stillness, Victoria confronted the belief that had governed her life since Abigail's death. She had convinced herself that control prevented chaos, that emotional distance protected against loss. Yet sitting beside Caleb, she recognized that avoidance had never prevented grief. It had only postponed connection. The boys had not destabilized her life. They had exposed the limits of her philosophy. She gave them a home, they gave her accountability. As Caleb's health improved steadily, Victoria announced the launch of a national housing ethics initiative named in Abigail Hale's memory. The program aimed to integrate predictive analytics with mandatory social impact assessments, ensuring that redevelopment projects incorporated safeguards before implementation rather than after controversy. It was not an act of image repair, it was a structural correction. For the first time, her professional influence aligned fully with personal conviction. Back at the estate, the formal family portrait that once hung rigidly in the hallway was replaced. In its place, Victoria chose a candid photograph taken in the hospital room, a quiet moment where Caleb, still pale but smiling, leaned slightly toward her while Ethan stood close beside them. No staged symmetry, no composed authority, only presence. The ending was not flawless. Health required vigilance. Reform demanded persistence. Relationships required continued honesty. Yet the resolution felt genuine rather than polished. Victoria Hale no longer sought dominance as proof of security. She chose presence over power, responsibility over reputation. For the first time in her life, Victoria Hale no longer feared losing control because she finally understood that some things are meant to change you. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that strength is not the same as control, stay connected. Stories like this are not about headlines or power. They are about the choices that quietly shape who we become. Share this with someone who believes growth sometimes comes from the hardest truths, and follow along for more stories that challenge the heart as much as the mind. Victoria believed she was saving two boys when she gave them a home. But in the end, they were the ones who forced her to confront the truth about herself. So here's the question. If someone you helped one day challenged everything you built, and they were right, would you feel betrayed or grateful? I'd really like to hear your answer.